I'll bring us down and bring an intro in here, man.
Great.
Welcome to the Fergus Falls Business Spotlight Podcast, the show that takes a deep dive into local businesses and the individuals that run our community. To guide you along the way, here's your host, Jacob Bittner.
Oh, welcome in. Gosh, welcome in, everybody. This is a fun one. This is exciting. I think this is my second political episode. I was thinking this was going to be my first, but I did indeed have Mayor Ben Shire on for a great highlight of his position locally. So I'm excited to get into this. I have Senator Jordan Rasmusson in the seat today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Great to be with you, Jacob. Looking forward to our conversation.
Me as well. You know, I made it past the handlers. I wasn't sure if your handler was going to come in here with you today or not. You know, we'll just leave it at that. But it takes a lot more work to get people onto the show, the more important they become. I'll just say that. So congratulations in your success in your career, getting to this point. And I had a lot of fun talking with your people to finally get you into the seat here. So thank you very much. You know who you are if you're listening. I'm sure you are, to make sure that we're saying the right things, but we really appreciate you. I really, really appreciate, the Senate office and their willingness to have you on the show. I think it'll be really cool for our community to hear about where you've come from, and how you've got into your position and what you're doing for the state now. So welcome in this morning, man.
Great to be with you. And happy to talk about the work we're doing down at the state capitol representing this area. We just finished up the legislative session a few weeks ago. And so that's been a lot of the conversations I've been having with our neighbors, is just telling them what happened this last session and what I've been working on, what went well, and what are some of the bills that passed that I think weren't ready to get passed.
Well, we're going to get into that a little bit. To be honest, I had some topics I wanted to talk about, but then I thought about it and it's like, you know what, the meat of this conversation, we don't have a lot of time. The meat of this conversation is I want to talk about how we're all connected to Fergus Falls here, right? Like, how did we go? If you want to hear a layout of kind of our local government, that Ben Shire episode's a great way to do it. We'll get into that a little bit, the layout and the structure of the government, but everything's connected. We are the Fergus Falls Business Spotlight Podcast. I want to take this half hour to talk about Fergus businesses and how it's connected from us up to you. And so, but before that, I give every guest the run through on their background, and you have a very interesting one. So let's start with your background. As a kid growing up in Fergus Falls.
Grew up in Fergus Falls, graduated from the Fergus Falls High School, go Otters. And then after graduating, had the chance to go out and do my college at Harvard. So studied out there in Massachusetts. And then after graduating, came back to Minnesota, worked in the business world. I was a management consultant, so I was hired to help companies and business leaders figure out how to improve their operations, find the next exciting opportunities for their business, and really enjoyed that work, enjoyed working in the private sector. And then also had the opportunity to work at Bain Capital as a private equity investor. And that basically means you're looking at businesses, figuring out what they're worth and what you could do if you own them. What would be the exciting opportunities to grow their business, make them more successful. And so I did that for a number of years.
You look like somebody who's good with numbers.
I like math. And that's a helpful thing down in the state government too, because we're dealing with budgets that are $70 billion and have really big implications for the people in our community, what numbers are on the spreadsheet. And so then my then girlfriend, now wife, Emma, and I decided we wanted to come back to Fergus Falls. And at the time, our longtime, now former state representative, Bud Nornis, another great radio legend, was retiring from the Minnesota House and sat down with me in the Viking Cafe and said, Jordan, do you want to run for the legislature? And so Emma and I went back and forth a long time and prayed about it and felt called to serve. And so was elected to the Minnesota House in 2020. And then a similar situation happened in 2022 when our state senator, Bill Engelbretson, decided to retire, also sat down with me at the Viking Cafe and said, Jordan, do you want to run for the Senate? And we decided to do it. And now I've just finished up my fourth legislative session, my second representing West Central Minnesota in the Senate.
Awesome. Okay, that's a good overview of your background. I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into some things. So let's talk about this. Young Democrats of America as a kid. This is true about you.
Yes, I didn't become a conservative until college. And there's, very few people who become a conservative at Harvard. But for me, a really transformative experience was, not only studying economics, studying the origins of our political system, getting to read the founding fathers in college. That was a lot of the courses I took. But a really transformative experience for me was when I had the opportunity to study for a semester at the University of Havana in Cuba. And this was back before Cuba had really opened up. So we had to get a special visa from the Treasury Department, take a charter plane into Cuba, and all my classes there were with Cuban students. And so I really got to see what life was like in a communist dictatorship that's not that far away from America. And that experience, I guess, showed to me the value of free market enterprise. It really underscored how when you have government controlling every aspect of life, how that squashes opportunity and human flourishing for everyone. And it also invades on just basic human rights. And so I came back with a greater appreciation for the principles of the American founding and for our free enterprise system. And that drove both my passion for advancing conservative policies, but also my interest in jumping into the private sector and just understanding, when you have efficient capital allocation, when you have businesses that are doing well and are successful, that creates opportunities for everyone.
I like that. I like that. So you and I, we've talked kind of off the mic. I won't get into that. I'm not going to take what was off the record onto the record. We share viewpoints in a lot of ways, and we differ, I think, on a few topics as well. We'll get into at least one of those topics here that I don't think you and I see eye to eye on, so I'm interested in that. But yeah, that's just a very, very interesting background experience. Did you find, so it was mainly going and visiting Cuba. Did you have, I guess, any influence at Harvard that led to that as well? Just the courses you studied with the founding fathers and all of that? Or did you have like a professor or somebody that you connected with there?
A couple professors and courses in particular. I had Greg Mankiw, who worked in the Bush administration, was George Bush's chief economic advisor, was my Econ 101 professor. And so just getting to learn economics, the principles of market economics, what drives growth, was, I think, really formative for me. And then additionally, probably my favorite course I took in college was called American Political Thought. And all we basically did was read speeches, letters, documents from our founding fathers and the people that preceded them, some of the thought leaders that laid the groundwork for the American Revolution, and all the way up to reading Ronald Reagan speeches and just getting to see that America truly is an exceptional country. You don't see many countries that are this big, this diverse, that have had a successful democratic republic for this long and have had advancements in human rights, healthcare innovation. There's a lot of special things going on in America, and I feel very passionately about ensuring that future generations have just as many opportunities as the generations that came before us, and hopefully more opportunities and more rights.
So in that transition from being a young Democrat into a now Republican state senator, the haters come out. The haters arise, right? I mean, I'm sure you've dealt with probably people being openly in opposition to you, and why, and how could you have changed your mind and all that. How have you dealt with that? I'll just call it pressure from a local level for people that knew you prior and don't understand how and why you are the way you are now.
I think first off, I think most people understand that young people, their viewpoints are shaped by their experience and what they get to see and what they learn. And so I have found when I came back, I wrote a column in the local paper, and it was just titled "How I Became a Conservative," and just kind of laid out, the story that we're talking about now.
I think that was my first, that article was probably my first intro to you as a politician. I was like, very interesting article. I read that one. So,
and I think, people on different sides of the political spectrum, I think, had, thoughts, comments, and that's just a part of politics, right? It's a debate of ideas. It's a debate of viewpoints. We discuss what should the priorities be of government at different levels. And so, that doesn't bother me. There's going to be different viewpoints and different ideas about what the role of government should be in our lives. And that's really the fundamental question is, what do people in this community across the state, what do they want from their state government, their local government, their federal government?
you can see the hat, people. How I feel. But
I'm going to have to get one of those hats. I'm going to have to get one of those.
Here's the deal. I've stayed very, very neutral on this show, and I think that I am, and I strive to be a very moderate and very, very see both sides of the aisle, and particularly in the way I try to approach the content of this show is from a very, very, I want to see both sides of it. I want to be able to talk about both sides of it. So don't come at me with your guys' opinions. I'm going to get into a topic here that really matters on a local level. I don't know. We're already 10 minutes into this supposed 30-minute interview, so we're not going to have a lot of time to talk about I want to, but we're for sure going to talk about cannabis. There's some big stuff happening on a local level with cannabis. By the time this interview comes out, we will have heard our city council's decision on the local zoning ordinance and how they're going to approach that. But before we get into that and the specific legislative topics, whatever we have time to get to, let's talk about the structure here. So I had Ben Shire on, and in that episode, I mentioned that the closer you get to home, the more disconnected we should be from our national political parties. I hate the two-party system anyways. I think everybody hates the fact that we have to subscribe to it. You probably don't want to comment on that or can't, but it's very destructive to have two parties to choose from. So I think it's very cool that on a local level, we kind of get to strip that back a little bit. I know that if Ben and I were to have talked national politics, we probably would have disagreed, but that's like a heart for Fergus Falls is what I feel like so many people have in common, regardless of whatever side of the political aisle they land on or where their issues, make or break opinions are on certain national issues. But like, we are here for Fergus Falls. So I think but as we get out of, the mayor to the city council to the city administrator, as we get out of that local government into state legislator and all that stuff, I feel like that's when the lines really start getting drawn politically. I mean, I don't believe that there's D and R next to names at a local level.
That's right. And this is a function of state law, and other states do it differently. And so in Minnesota, if you're running for mayor of Fergus Falls, city council, county commissioner, those are called nonpartisan races. And so when you look at the ballot, there's not going to be what political party or affiliation that individual has next to their name. In Minnesota, the first partisan races are for the state legislature. And so the Minnesota House, Minnesota Senate, those are partisan races. You have your party affiliation on the ballot for the U.S. House, U.S. Senate, governor, other statewide offices. And so some states do it differently. Some states have party ID for the local level. Nebraska is actually an interesting state where they technically have had nonpartisan state legislative races. So there's different ways that you can structure that, and there's always the debate, across states as to what's the right level to when you have party affiliation on the ballot versus like we do for local races, you don't have a party affiliation.
Yeah, and we're not going to get too into the topics of the general big election driving campaign with Trump and what's going on and all that stuff right now, but it, I think, is very, very destructive and very, very damaging to local politicians when you ask them to attach themselves to a large narrative that's happening outside of their control. I mean, whether you are a Democrat who doesn't necessarily want to be associated with what's going on in the Biden administration, or whether you're a Republican who doesn't want to be associated with what's going on with the Trump fiasco, there's a certain level of quality of opinion I think we miss out on as people, because politicians are toting the party line a little too much. They got to make people happy. So having that been said, let's talk about the structure of that Minnesota government. A lot of people hear you're a senator. They think you go to Washington, D.C. That's what I thought right away, too. I heard, oh, Jordan's a senator. He's like, I knew there was, is there a couple senators from Minnesota that go to Washington, D.C., but I believe there's 67. Is that number right?
That's right.
67 here in our state. And so you are you guys are the state Senate. So do you want to explain that state Senate, state representative, and some maybe misconceptions about what you do?
Yeah. So, I think the best way to think about it is, we basically have, two legislatures. We have our national legislature, the Congress that meets in Washington, D.C. We have representatives and U.S. senators that we send to Washington to represent our state, our area. And then we also have, and this is a product of our Constitution, is we have state governments that also have responsibilities in our system. And so our communities also elect state representatives and state senators to go and represent them at our state capitol in St. Paul. And so, my kind of fundamental job is I have about 85,000 constituents, cover 5 counties here in West Central Minnesota, and it's my job to be their voice down in the Minnesota Senate. And, whether it's introducing legislation, voting for a bill, voting against a bill, offering amendments, making sure that if they have questions or problems with state agencies, that I'm helping them navigate the bureaucracy, which can be a challenge sometimes. And so that's kind of the role. And it's just a lot of great people, a lot of great communities that I get to work on behalf down in St. Paul.
Cool. So that state government structure is very similar to the national structure. We have the legislative branch, the executive branch, the judicial branch, just like the national level, and a lot of the laws that get passed in Minnesota happen in similar fashion to the Schoolhouse Rock jingle that we all learned as a kid, right?
That's right. So a bill, like I introduce legislation, it gets introduced in the Senate.
So you can write a bill and introduce a bill?
Yes. Yep. And that's we had in the Minnesota legislature over the last 2 years, I think more than 10,000 bills get introduced. Those are, lots of ideas. Some of them are good, some are bad. Some are big bills like legalizing recreational cannabis, and some are, maybe changing the speed limit on a specific road. They're very small. And so legislators introduce these bills, we debate them, we offer amendments, and they have to pass both the House and the Senate, and then the governor has to sign it, or the governor can veto a bill. And so that's a lot of people get frustrated with the process because it can be challenging to start off with that initial idea that you want to change something and actually get that done and signed into law by the governor. But I actually think it should be tough because there's a lot of bad ideas that we don't just want rushed into law. We want to make sure that constituents have an opportunity to review what's been introduced, to provide comment and feedback to their legislature. A lot of my job, too, is taking phone calls, emails, letters from people that have opinions on different bills. They support a gun control measure, or they're opposed to a gun control measure. They want to make sure that their viewpoints are communicated to their legislator. And that's a big piece of our job, too, is telling people, back home what's going on at the Capitol, getting their feedback, and then trying our best to represent them and to do the best for the state.
So a lot of these bills, I know on a national level, are drafted up by like these huge agencies, and basically the people kind of, you have these huge, I saw a picture of you with just like this huge, thick, multi-page bill, and like that stuff happens on both ends of the spectrum. That's a political game that both parties play whenever they are in control, or they have power, or they want to cram something through without people being able to understand the context of it, which seems like it's probably every bill you get. Man, I don't really want to spend too much of our time because we only have like 11 minutes left here of your allotted time by your handler. So we gotta keep moving along.
Well,
but
we can. I'll keep an eye on the clock.
Okay,
I think we can go a little.
We can push it. We can push it. We can push it. Okay.
Yeah.
But that process of the loaded up bills, I know one of the things you wanted to talk about was one party control. That was one of the things that topics you want to talk about. Why don't you touch on that a little bit? And then I have some thoughts on that as well, because I do not believe it's one side of the aisle that does this any more or worse than the other. It's just whoever happens to have the control at that period of time. But I would love to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, so over the last 2 years, we have had single party control down in St. Paul. The Democrats have had a majority in the House, a majority in the Senate, and have also had the governor's office. And so effectively, they've been able to do whatever they want as long as they can get members of their party to agree to it. And so Republicans haven't been required to be at the table. And frankly, on a lot of these key marquee issues, the Democrats have said, well, we're in charge, we're going to make the decision. And I think the kind of worst example we saw of this was in the final hour of the legislative session. The Democrats had fallen behind on their legislative schedule. There was a Senate Democrat, Nicole Mitchell, who was arrested on first-degree burglary charges, and so that canceled about a week of floor session because she was literally in jail and not able to come and be the deciding vote in the Minnesota Senate for the Democrats. And then we had another Senate Democrat who basically said he wasn't going to show up until he got a deal on his Uber Lyft proposal. So he was AWOL for an entire day. And so the Democrats had a bunch of bills they wanted to pass at the very end. And so in the last hour, they unveil a nearly 1,500-page bill. And that's what I had that picture of me holding the bill. And they passed it through both the House and the Senate without any debate. And they've had 2 years to pass their priority bills, their priority agenda. And I think that shows an abuse of power when you don't even allow the minority party to debate bills. You don't even allow the people of Minnesota to know what's in the bill. There was one copy at the desk. You couldn't read it online. And literally, people were voting on a bill that they didn't know what was in it. And I think that's concerning. There's a lot of good bipartisan work that happens. I had a bill that I was an author on, had worked on, that passed the Senate unanimously to help out emergency medical services. So there can be good bipartisan work that does take place. But unfortunately, we saw a very partisan end to that last couple hours of session.
Why don't you just recap that session quick and just kind of like what happened? What were like the main takeaways from that legislative session this year?
Yeah, I think, for me, there was a lot of hope early on that we were going to be able to fix some of the damage that was done last year. One of my big concerns was in the state budget, the Democrats increased state government spending by about 38%. And we not only spent the $18 billion surplus, we also increased taxes by $10 billion as a state. And I don't think that's fiscally sustainable. Minnesota's already a top 5 tax state in the country. And with inflation, people's budgets are already stretched. To be adding on additional tax burden right now, I didn't think was the right answer. Unfortunately, we saw additional payroll taxes. We saw different regulations that are going to increase the costs of goods and services. And I wish we could have gotten some more bipartisan work done. I would say one of the bright moments from this session was getting that $30 million for our local ambulances. About $4 million of that is going to end up coming here to West Central Minnesota. We're also going to have a Sprint Medic pilot program here in Ottertail County and Grant County to help reduce response times. And so that was a good bipartisan bill that got done, but there's a number of disappointments too.
So, but that's as far as what like affecting us locally here. Those are the two things you mentioned. Response times on ambulances should be faster.
That's the goal.
The goal. That's the theory.
Yep. The goal is to help make sure that when we have a neighbor who has a medical emergency and they need an ambulance to show up, that they get the care they need.
But let me fill you in on a little secret. Throwing money at something doesn't solve the problem. So hopefully whoever's set to take that money is solving the problem with it. Because that's my biggest downfall with a lot of the things that happen within our government is I don't think the government is the most efficient in spending money. And I don't think that the government does nearly anything as well as the private sector does. But again, that's probably flashing my cards a little bit, but I believe that a lot of money doesn't go as far when you give it to the government to spend as it does if you were to give it to the people who understand what's actually happening with it.
Yeah, and a good thing about this is that the money will be going to the providers.
Right.
And then as a part of this bill, we also had some regulatory relief. So we're making it easier for people who used to be paramedics, EMTs to get into the field. We're making it easier for nurses, physicians assistants who are interested in the field to get into the field. And so I agree that we have to make sure that government isn't making the problem worse.
Awesome. All right. Let's talk about HF 100, the state cannabis legislation, the state cannabis bill. this Minnesota differed than a few states in this, in the sense that it was a legislative bill. It was not we did not get a unanimous public vote like we would have gotten had it gone to a ballot. I'm sure of the fact that Minnesota would have gone unanimously for it. There's absolutely nothing to make me believe otherwise based on every time it's gone to a popular vote in any other state. You've seen, Maryland, over 67% of the popular vote in Maryland went to supporting legalization of cannabis. This is something that the people want. This is something that a majority of the people want. So this is a bill you did not support.
That's correct. I voted against the bill, but it was a bill that I worked on quite extensively. So I had the opportunity to serve on the conference committee that put together the final bill that legalized recreational cannabis. And I was actually the only member of that conference committee that voted against the bill. And the reason I did is because there was a lot of aspects to it that weren't ready. And we're kind of living with some of the consequences of that now, where we've effectively decriminalized recreational cannabis, but we don't yet have a legal market, a legal framework. And so I have concerns about, and I think we've seen this, where we have a legal product on the market. We have product that hasn't been tested. It's getting people sick that are using it. And it's creating a lot of issues for law enforcement. And so, to give some examples of amendments that I offered both last year and this year to try to improve the public safety aspects, one of the big issues that we saw with legalized recreational cannabis is that while the bill says that individuals under the age of 21 can't use or possess, there's no penalty in law for using or possessing cannabis underage, which is very different than how we treat alcohol for minors. It's very different than how we treat tobacco for minors. And so I offered both when this bill came forward and this year in the Minnesota Senate amendments to just have parity, to say, hey, we need to make sure we're giving law enforcement, school administrators, parents tools to make sure that cannabis isn't getting into the hands of underage individuals. And so that's, I think, one example of many about how where, yes, there might be Minnesotans who say, okay, I'm okay with recreational cannabis, adult use cannabis, but how you do it really makes an impact. And I don't think this was the right way to do it.
Interesting. I actually, that's interesting. I tend to agree with what you said. Now, having that been said, let's say you met those amendments got added in, or would it have ever been a bill you would have supported, or were you always just trying to find flaws in it?
No, my goal was to, I think it was going to pass, with the makeup of the legislature and the governor saying that he supported, I think it was going to pass. And so for me, my goal was, how can we try to put in safeguards? How can we make sure that we have funding for law enforcement? So I worked with the Sheriff's Association, the Police Chief Association, to get ongoing funding from the cannabis tax for drug recognition expert training, because we don't have a field test for cannabis in the same way we do for alcohol. I also was able to get funding to make sure that pregnant women understand the impact of using cannabis while pregnant, on themselves, on their babies. Unfortunately, some of that funding was actually cut this year by the Democrats. So that's really where I focused then. Was, okay, if this is going to become law, what are some things we can do to try to best protect the public? And I think, cannabis, we had another bill on it this year. I think this is going to be a topic at the legislature that we are going to talk about almost every year. And that'll be my continued goal, is to, okay, it's legal. How can we make it as safe as possible for the public?
Yeah, we've got a super hot topic locally right now. I mean, like I said, by the time this comes out, we will have heard our city council's decision on the zoning. I know that there's some things in the legislation. Our police chief gave a really, really good overview of what the city is allowed and isn't allowed to do as far as issuing licenses and zoning and all of that. So if you guys haven't listened to, I should know our police chief's name. Shame on me for not knowing that, but you should absolutely listen to him at the city council, and because he does give a really good overview, so you'll understand what the city is and isn't allowed to do. But this zoning thing is basically, it has to do with proximity to daycares, proximity to parks, proximity to certain things that they're kind of trying to keep us away from. I tend to think that this is just, we are stuck in a period right now where there's stigmas that need to be broken about it. I think it's been a forbidden, taboo substance for far too long. And I think that as a society, we need to start viewing it a lot more like alcohol, and make sure that we are not over regulating. This is my biggest thing, right? I want it to be easier for people to do business in Fergus Falls. I want it to be easier for somebody in business, regardless of whether or not they're selling products that you agree with or don't disagree. If those products are legal at a state level, if they're allowed to sell them, it should be easier rather than harder for them to do their business. So that's always going to be my simple approach on everything, is bring it back to what is easier for the business owner, what makes our economy work better at a local level. So I think less regulation in general is always better on that. But that'll close off cannabis. But I do want to talk about, if we have time, do you want to touch on housing, homelessness, environmental policies, tax reform budget at all? Do you want to talk about what's important to you out of those?
Yeah, I just, briefly, the first bill that I introduced when I got to the Minnesota Senate was to eliminate the tax on Social Security. So Minnesota, we're one of only 11 states that still taxes Social Security. Last year, we were able to make some progress on having that tax hit fewer people, but we still have work to do to make sure that we don't have Minnesota seniors who have paid into Social Security now getting double taxed on that retirement money that's coming to them. One of the other bills that I introduced this session would have created a tax-free retirement for Minnesota retirees up to $150,000 per couple. And one of the things that I hear in our area is, with Minnesota income tax being some of the highest in the country, that we're losing people to other states, whether it's North Dakota and South Dakota. We're here in the border community, people deciding that they want to retire to states down south. And I think we need to make sure that we're competitive from a tax perspective. And especially when we've had record surpluses over the past few years, to me, that means that we're taxing too much. And we need to give more back to Minnesota taxpayers.
How about looking ahead a little further to some of the, I think all those things that you just mentioned probably fall into your priorities for the next legislative session. When is that? How often do those legislative sessions happen?
So we will be back in regular session in January of next year. And that will be after Election Day. And so in the Minnesota House, every single member of the House is up for election this November. And so we'll see who the voters send down to St. Paul. For the Senate, normally the Senate isn't up until 2026, but we've had one resignation from the Senate Democrats. And so there will be a special election on the ballot in November in this one district in the western suburbs of the Twin Cities. And whoever wins that race, that will actually determine who's in the majority for the next 2 years in the Minnesota Senate.
Wow.
So it will be quite the marquee political event here in Minnesota, where if the Democrats win, they'll continue their control in the Minnesota Senate. If the Republicans win, they'll now be in the majority. And the pitch that I would make to those voters is that we've had 2 years of single-party control. I think we've seen extreme policies on taxes, regulations, divisive social debates. And I think Minnesota would benefit from having some balance restored. The Republicans aren't going to, take over state government in November. Governor Walz has a 4-year term. But I think it's important to have both parties at the table. I think we'll get to better decisions for Minnesotans, and especially make sure that Greater Minnesota, which is largely represented by Republicans, isn't forgotten in a lot of the important policy debates that are had in St. Paul.
I see you working in some campaign election topics there. I thought we weren't going to talk about those.
Elections have consequences.
I get it.
Elections have consequences.
They do. And
they affect
And
the
so
policy.
does the national election. I would have loved to have got your opinion on those topics. What's going on with the divisiveness of the candidate, potential candidate to be of your party. So, but we're not going to get into it. I'm not going to go there. So I do want to get, though, this is on par with all of the episodes I do. I need your biggest surprise that you got in politics. Like, what surprised you the most getting into a career as a politician?
I think how much fun you get meeting people and hearing their stories. And you get to hear some really awesome success stories from entrepreneurs that have, grown up in this area, built businesses, had success. You get to hear heartbreaking stories from families that have struggled and have, faced real challenges in their life. And I think it's such a privilege to get to hear people's stories in our community and to try to take those stories and to think about what public policy, what decisions the state government should be making to try to increase human flourishing across the state. And so that, I think, has been, I knew that was a part of the job, but you don't really get to feel how special it is until you get to, knock on doors, talk to people, have them come into your office at the Capitol and share their story with you.
I like it. I think that's meeting people is awesome. That's why I love doing this podcast. I get to meet people in a whole different way, unpack their stories in a different way. So yeah. How about best business advice?
Best business advice. Yeah. So I'll go back to my, days as a private equity investor and in the management consulting space. I would say it's important to understand different scenarios that could play out in the future. I think a lot of business leaders kind of have one idea in mind of, this is what's going to happen to my business over the next year, over the next 5 years. And in reality, events shape things. How many people could have predicted the impact that COVID was going to have on our economy and society? Our interest rate's going to go up or going to go down. And so I think it's important for business leaders to plan for multiple scenarios on what could take place over the next, year, over the next 5 years, and to be ready for those different scenarios as best as they can be. Because I think where businesses can get in trouble is when they really plan on one thing happening and then that doesn't happen or it's different. And that's, I've seen some really good businesses and good business leaders get behind the eight ball pretty quick by not thinking about different scenarios that could play out.
Got to have contingencies.
That's right.
Well, thank you very much, Jordan. I appreciated this time we had. I would have loved to have talked with you for 2 hours and got to all of these topics I had originally sent you guys, but this was really, really fun. And if you ever want to come back on here and talk about more stuff, I would be interested in, but it's going to have to be a little bit, I think I want to do national. If you're going to come back on the show, I think we got to get into some national politics, but.
Well, thanks, Jacob. And I look forward to being back and appreciate the opportunity to talk about my path and some of the work I've been working on down at the state capitol.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to all the supporters of the show, all the listeners, the sponsors, of course, Stumbino's, Lakes Area Grow Co., Victor Lundeen's, everybody else who's coming on to join the show recently here as well. Just big things ahead for the Fergus Falls Business Spotlight. So thanks for listening, and hope you enjoyed this one. We will be back with more of these always every Monday.